You are still talking to at least one of us. Now there looks like about 27 people.
Okay, good. So what is a license? Might be an easy question. It's that thing you just click without reading whenever you install software, and it's all the stuff that you must have agreed to on your cell phone because you wouldn't be using it unless you did. So I'm sure you've all read your licenses on all the apps and software in your laptops and maybe in your software that's in your thermostat or I don't know, wherever. So relevant licenses to software. If I was in class, I would point at somebody and make them fill in these, but since we're virtual, I won't do that. But they're copyright, patent, and trademark licenses. So those are the types of licenses that you'll most likely need to work with as a software developer, as someone startup, or if you're selling software, or if you're creating an open source project. These are the three main licenses. So a license is really just, as a noun, I'm giving you a license for you to do something, to use something. You're getting permission as me, as the original author, as the person who created this, whatever it is. It could be a picture, it doesn't have to be just software. I'm giving you permission to use it. That's as a verb, but it basically grants a set of permissions around roles and responsibilities. So these restrictions or these permissions that are included with the right license. So these are things like scope. Okay, what's being licensed? Do you get all if I buy Adobe Photoshop, do I get everything Adobe has ever created? Or if not, and then how long can I use it? Is it 1 year, annual? Is it every time I do some bit of processing I pay for it? What are the conditions for the duration of use? Do I have to renew this? Is it in perpetuity? What are the conditions to use? I can only use it myself. I can only use it on 10 machines. I can only use it while students are in class. I can only, what are those conditions? How am I protected against liabilities, indemnification? If I use the software for something critical and the software fails, who's responsible? How do I audit the software from both sides? As if it's closed source, how do I know the software is doing what I want it to do? Or from the other way around, how does the person that licensed it to me know that I'm using the software in alignment or agreement with the license? IP protection, sort of not giving away trade secrets or stealing functionality or unique features and putting in other things. Warranties, payments, infringement, all those sorts of things are usually part, and much more could be part of a license, whether that's a copyright, patent, or trademark license. And then what is it that you're actually licensing? So obviously there's the code. So you've got a copyright license for the code. That's no different than music or a poem or a photograph. The US, they've ruled that source code is no different than the story of written by an author of a book or an article. Content, that could be, other than text, it could be the images that are included if it's a video game, or data that's generated from it, the graphs, plots, whatever it might be. Patents, those patents are supposed to be novel functionality. So while the OSI and I personally don't believe in patents for software, they are something that exists. So you should be aware of them. And then trademarks, I think most people know what trademarks are, those symbols and graphics and words that might be associated with a product or a company and so on. So you can license all this stuff. I, as the owner of that, as the creator of that, can give you permission to use that as long as you do X, Y, and Z. It might be just pay me. It might be stand on your foot once a day. Who knows? Could be anything. So again, usually when I'm in the class, I ask folks to sort of try to guess what the objects I'm going to show you are. Is it a copyright license would be applicable? Would a patent license be applicable? Or a trademarking license be patentable or applicable? And so real quickly, again, copyright licenses are for creative work and grants permission from the original creator to others to use that work. Patents are, again, supposed to be novel inventions, and it gives the inventor gives others the right to use any technology based on that patent, and trademark allows someone else to use the name, the brand of another organization that can be licensed. So RPI could has a trademark license, I'm sure. So what would this be? So without expecting anyone to answer, I'll answer my own question. So hopefully I'll get it right. Well, the text itself could be copyrighted. So it could be a dictionary, or it could be translations or whatever it might be. So that text itself, the book, could be copyrighted, which means I can't copy it and sell it. I can't copy it and change it. I can't use it, pieces of it from my own work, unless I get a license. The image itself might be copyrighted. Somebody took this photograph and thought it was a cool picture and it conveyed some visual message, so they own it and they only license it out. The magnifying glass could be some unique tool that has some unique lens that's really good for just text versus other things. So that could be patented. This could be a trademark. It'd be sort of tough to protect or to show, uniqueness, the magnifying glass. But if this became your company's brand, you could possibly have a trademark around this, and then you could license this image under your trademark license. Here's a drawing of a mouse, at least an old school mouse before the laser ones. And again, the drawing itself could be copyrighted. This could be a drawing that's included with a patent, and maybe you could use this as a trademark. Obviously, I think this one's just a trademark, and you could license this if Nike wants to allow Union Sports, not Union, RPI sports teams to use the Nike logo. They would enter into a trademark agreement with the campus. Music, here's Happy Birthday to You. The people who wrote this have a copyright on it, and you cannot take this music and make copies and sell it. You cannot even perform this for a long time. If you're old enough, you might see old television shows where it's somebody's birthday and they don't sing Happy Birthday to You, they sing something else because they didn't want to have to pay for permission to sing the song. So it's no different than any pop song or song you might hear today. It's copyrighted. Interestingly, the copyright expired on this, and so now if you watch TV, you'll see people singing Happy Birthday. One other factor that I didn't mention, I should say, is that the right as a copyright holder and a patent holder after a while goes away, and it depending on the type of copyright, the material that's being copyrighted, or the patent. But so the dates vary. A trademark doesn't. The difference there is a trademark, you have to constantly protect it. If you let your trademark lapse, meaning that all of a sudden everyone's using the Nike swoosh and Nike never goes after anyone, that's basically you've lost your trademark. So there are time limits and caveats to the continued use of any licensable material. Here's this is always one that gets me. So here's a series of activities around getting a message and forwarding it on to your doctor. So somebody had submitted to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office a patent for answering a telephone call from a patient and taking a note and forwarding that message onto a doctor. The only difference was it was done on a computer. And believe it or not, this was actually accepted. And so if you ever create software that takes a message from a patient and forwards it onto a doctor, you are violating someone's patent. The EFF, Electronic Freedom, not Freedom Foundation. Oh, I can't think of it. Anyway, they have a stupid patents of the month page where they list all these crazy patents. This is one of them. So this is a patent. This would obviously be copyright. It's an article from the New York Times. This is not really source code. It's a makefile, but it's the first file from the Netscape browser, so I put it in there. But that's copyrighted and licensed accordingly. So if you look at the benefits of open source software, they're all dependent upon open source licenses. You can't do any of the things that everyone likes most about open source software without the license. So many people might think that open source software doesn't have a license because I can just take it and use it. And they think of a license as being something where, well, I must have to sign something or click a button. And because I didn't have to do that with open source software, it must mean that it's not licensed. No, it is licensed. and without that license, you wouldn't be able to take advantage of all the benefits. So as an example, just think of a procurement process for a company or for RPI or for you, even as an individual. You might not go through such a formal set of steps, but you're doing this in your head when you think about software you might want to use. So the first thing you do is you identify if there's an interest in this. Does the software work for you? Is it for sale? You could say, is it accessible? Is it for sale commercially? Is it open source? If it was proprietary software, you'd have to say, can you sell it? No. If it's not for sale, you're out of luck. You can't use it. You can't get a license for it. They won't make it available to you. So then you have to go and negotiate with the vendor. Say, hey, I know you have this tool. Can you possibly license it to me? We'd be interested in using it for whatever. They might do that. Or if they do have it for sale, then does the license actually meet your needs? So they might have a license that's too restrictive for you. So then you need to go again back to the vendor and say, hey, we know that this typically is only licensed for for computer labs, but we want to give it to all of our students so they can install it on their laptops or whatever it might be. So you have to negotiate through this. Does it meet the functionality, the features there, integrations, distribution? You go through, and eventually, if you can negotiate all of that, you'll get to use the software. So open source software provides permission first. That is, you can use, modify, distribute the software without going through that, because the licenses have been vetted through the OSI's license review process, and they're certified as compliant with the open source definition. So that gives you permission first just through that license. We know it's an OSI approved license, so I know I can do all this stuff. I don't have to go through this whole process. And a key thing to remember here is that the license for open source licenses only apply during distribution, not use. So I can download that software and use it within my laptop, my home, just on my laptop, just in my home, just at my company. And as long as it's that my entity, whether it's the business, it's the personal use, it's personal computers, I can do anything I want. I can modify it. I can put it on 50 machines in my company. I can do anything I want. It's only when I choose to either take that software, whether I've changed it or not, or if I've changed it, and distribute it to a friend, give it to someone else, that I need to comply with the license. So the licensing terms apply at the point of distribution, not at the point of installation. Here's a comment from an attorney and sort of summing it up that of course, the happy path is discover the project has a single clear OSI compliant license. In those situations, open source software is as easy as downloading going forward. There's nothing else you need to do. And you can see at all these stages, I tried to sort of insert points where the open source definition guarantees these freedoms and therefore gives permission first, right? So is it for sale? No, you can go get it, download it, source code, there's no cost. That doesn't mean you can't sell open source software. That's another misnomer. That you should be, people can take the software and sell it. Maybe they're selling the fact that they've put it together in a nice package that's easily installed, or they have supplemental training information, or they provide support, or they, whatever it might be. They create versions for different platforms, whatever it might be. You can sell that software. Of course, there's nothing stopping someone from going and getting their own copy of it. They don't have to pay for it. So you can go through all these and you can see how that traditional procurement process becomes irrelevant and is disrupted by the open source definition and those criteria. So then looking at the same terms of a license, but this time considering the open source definition, the scope is anyone can use it for any purpose and any technology. Every OSI license allows that in perpetuity, forever. It's not determined by the copyright holder how long you can use it. Same with renewal. I mean, you never need to renew it, so that's sort of moot. There are conditions of use. We'll talk about that in a minute with permissive and copyleft licenses, but all licenses, even the most permissive, require you to send on the sort of information about the original copyright information, the authorship. You have to include the license. People have to know what license that this original stuff that you're either distributing is distributed with, so that they know what license is applicable. Indemnification, it's as is, no warranties. The source code is included so you can audit it. The people that are creating it are distributing it, so they don't need to audit you. although that sometimes that does take place within copyleft licenses to make sure that any derivative works are also compliant with the GPL. Payments, again, no cost, and so on. So all the issues are still there. The terms of a license are still there in an open source license. They just manifest differently due to the open source definition. So I won't go through all these, but I understand you're getting the slide. So here are some lists of all the benefits of open source software. And if you take the time to go through and read them, you'll see how all of these are only possible because of the 4 freedoms: the right to use, modify, study, and redistribute the work. So there's lots of terms out there about free and open source software. So what's the difference between free software and open source? Permissive license, copyleft licenses. What about public domain? And those sorts of things. So copyleft is an open source licenses. Copyleft and permissive licenses are both open source licenses, but only copyleft licenses are free software licenses. So copyleft, as it says, is a general method for making a program free and requires modifications and extended versions of the program to be free as well. And free as in the free software definition. Whereas permissive license, like the MIT and the BSD licenses, only apply to the original work, which means that they can be, they're permitted to be included in even proprietary software. So there's no, they used to call it viral effect, where if you use GPL or free software in your software, because all derivative works and works that were distributed with the GPL license software also had to be GPL. So by inserting GPL software in what was previously proprietary software, that proprietary software, once distributed, had to be distributed under the GPL as well, whereas permissive licenses don't need that. So I keep talking about free, and I've sort of talked about it a little bit, but free really is the idea of free as in freedom and liberty, not free as in cost. And there is a difference between the ideals of the Free Software Foundation and GNU community, GNU project, excuse me, and they would not recognize or advocate for permissive licenses. But in reality, the OSI and the FSF work all the time together on all sorts of software freedom issues. And I've inserted some quotes in there because there's usually someone in the crowd who likes to bring up the perceived animosity between the free software and the open source software movements. But here are some examples of copyleft and permissive licenses, and then there's lesser. So that's sort of a neutral third ground where there's some aspects of copyleft and some aspects of permissive. Some interesting comments real quickly. The GPL, as I mentioned, is a copyleft license that requires derivative works or other software distributed as part of the same compiled, in the old days of compiling, or distributed works to be also GPL. What happened was when the cloud and software as a service became a thing, people were taking GPL software and putting it up on their server, hosting it remotely for folks, modifying it, and then offering those modifications as benefits, as distinctions that made their cloud service better than someone else's. So it was the original GPL code modified, but it was on the company server. And as I said before, because open source software licenses only take effect upon distribution, and that software was on their company server and thus never distributed, the rules around GPL never kicked in. So the FSF and the GNU folks decided to create the AGPL, which says, well, we're going to treat distribution as any time the public can access that software. So if software is now licensed under the AGPL, you can still run it remotely, but now if you make any modifications and you now make that service available to third parties through your hosting or cloud services, that software also has to be has to comply with the 4 freedoms. And the logic behind that is like, okay, I might not be running it, but I still want to know because I'm putting in my financial information. Or in this case, I had to log into Nooks with my personal Gmail account, and I don't know how they're going to use that. And so if Nooks was a GPL licensed tool, I would never know because they've never distributed it. But if it was a GPL, I'd be able to see the source code and see if they're doing anything nefarious or creepy with my login credentials or anything else. So that's sort of the copyleft side. The lesser, so for example, Mozilla and Eclipse, and the lesser, sometimes people think of it as the library GPL. You might not be distributing your software with the libraries. It's only calling libraries. So that's a way to address those issues. Then permissive is, like I said before, you can take that software as is and include it in proprietary software, and the original remains open source because it's under the MIT license or the BSD, but the derivative work or the combined work can be proprietary. And the Apache is in there because it does the same thing, but it also has patent provisions, whereas the BSD and MIT implies patent provisions because they were created before licensed patent or software patent became a big deal, but they're not expressly named in there. And that's a continual issue, but we won't get in here. And then there's public domain, which we'll talk about in a minute. So derivative works, talked about that already. Work based on based on one or more pre-existing works. I'm sure as developers, you're all accustomed with derivative works. So again, copyleft, I think I talked about this in the previous slide. Often copyleft is, you can think of it as being reciprocal. Whatever benefits you've enjoyed through the use of free software, you should reciprocate by making your work available to the community that supported you. And then permissive, as I mentioned, allows basically to do whatever you want as long as you continue to adhere to the original license to that specific work. One of the projects we worked on was something called TLDR Legal, and it's a great resource if you want to look up sort of the different types of licenses and what you can and cannot do. Gives you a little synopsis there, gives you examples. This is an older slide. Gives you examples of different software that's distributed with that. And then you can compare them. So looking at the MIT and the GPL, again, the MIT is a permissive license, the GPL is a copyleft or reciprocal license. And you can compare those and help you decide what, if any, open source license you want to look at. Another area, or assign your software to. Another area is public domain. So we often get questions about public domain. Is it free software? Is it open source? Is it the same? What's different? Is it better? Is it worse? And no, public domain software is not free or open source software. From a legal perspective, there is no copyright owner, anything associated with public domain software. It's in the public domain. It is, don't think of public domain as a category, think of it as a location. It's literally sitting on the park bench, and if you want that cup of half drunk, well, that's a negative. If you want that apple, or if you want anything, you can just take it, right? It doesn't belong to anyone, and you can do anything you want to it with it. So you can't license it because you don't own it. In that sense, you've waived any authorship or copyright or intellectual property claims around that when you submit something to the public domain. And if you're an open source or free software advocate, I would suggest that you don't want to do that, because if you value the idea of many of the benefits associated with free and open source software, putting something in the public domain actually hinders many of those benefits. So an example I often use is, let's imagine that the Forest Service created a fleet management tool for all of their trucks and backhoes and lawnmowers and snow plows and everything that they have. And because they're a public, a U.S. Government agency, and we own everything that they create, all their software that's original goes into the public domain. That's just the way it is. So now they've created this tool and it's in the public domain, and now anybody can come along and take that and use it. So Evil Corp here can now take this stuff that they found out in the public domain, and they can tweak it, or they don't even have to tweak it. They can do anything they want. Nobody owns it, so they can simply slap their name on it, and they can assign a license to it, and maybe they make modifications, maybe they don't. And then they can actually go back and, not knowing that the Forest Service, they're looking for, I don't know, some additional modules or extended functions or features for this. They can then license that and sell it back to the U.S. Forestry Service. And the Forestry Service may never know that it's essentially buying its own software back to them. They're buying their own software, or their own software is being sold back to them. So it disrupts that sort of network effect. It might be a noble cause that you just want to give it away, or maybe you don't want anything to do with it anymore. But if you're interested in fostering many of the aspects that enable open source and free software to thrive in the communities of practice to develop, public domain isn't a very good option. So people then ask, well, then what license is best? Our permissive license or copyleft license is best? Eben Moglen, who's a pretty well-known, one of the best-known intellectual property lawyers, focuses on open source, describes licenses as constitutions of communities. So the idea here is get with your community of developers and find a license that promotes the type of community you want to foster. So just using the two extreme examples, you might want to have a license where, look, if you benefited from our stuff, then you should give everything that you created from it back to us. Or it could be, look, take this, and the more people that we have using it means the more contributors we might have to it. Or so there might be all sorts of reasons that you might want to pick a certain license, and that license is a way of capturing the ethos, the culture of the development community. And you'll find folks that sort of align with that type of license, and they'll probably use or not use your software based on that license. But there's no best answer, because it's really asking what's the best type of open source project, or the best open source community, the best open source governance, all that sort of stuff, which I could never answer. I wouldn't know. And then Simon Phipps, who's twice president of the OSI, licenses express the consensus of how a community chooses to collaborate. And that ties in again with the ideals and the development practices and the distribution practices associated with that community. So it's natural that different communities will differ, and therefore the licenses differ. And that's why we see so many different options, and nobody's picking the same thing. So licensing strategies I touched on a little bit. One might be, again, for a copyleft, look, this is a valuable tool. If you think it's valuable, the license will require you to contribute back to it. So that's a copyleft license. You benefited from this. We think we'll get the most adoption and contribution and engagement by requiring all the different communities that are using it to work together and to communicate and share and contribute. Another might be, well, if everyone relies on my work, they'll all be committed to continuing development. So they'll get broader adoption. Oh, I don't have to make all of my software copyleft, but this MIT licensed rich text editor is great, and I'm going to use it, and I can embed it in my proprietary software. So that's one more person who might become a contributor who wouldn't have become a contributor if they had to use a copyleft license. So those are two extreme versions of strategies, but that sort of highlights how you might want to think about which license you're going to use. I think I already talked about this. A little bit about the sort of non-technical side. Again, free software and copyleft license have a connotation around a social movement, an ethical imperative that's essential to respect users' freedom. So there's a difference between users' freedom and software freedom. I think both the free software and open source communities would agree around software freedom, the focus on the freedom of the software, the liberty, the use of the software versus users' freedom, where those same attributes are focused on the end users. And then open source is usually described as sort of a practical, pragmatic approach to development. So how to foster the many eyeballs, how to create opportunities for mass network collaboration. So open source might lean toward development practices, whereas free software is more of a social movement. License compatibility, you should definitely be aware of issues around license compatibility. That is, if you take software that or code that's from licensed in two different ways, how can you make those work? Here's a nice little, there's a link there. So if you do get this file, there's a whole nice tutorial on this, but generally here's upstream, downstream views of combining multiple licensed works within a derivative project. So if you have something that's permissive, like the BSD, the MIT, or the Apache, or something like that, you can pretty much put it in anything. Your derivative work can be licensed under a permissive license. Now remember, the original work, you can't change the original work that you embedded. That copyright holder still exists, and that license is still applicable to their work. But if you've modified it, inserted it into a new project, created a derivative, whatever, bundled it with your distribution, that distribution, your combined work can be a permissive license, it can be a copyleft license, it can even be proprietary. If you use a copyleft license, everything coming in has to be copyleft. Theoretically, you could put in proprietary software, but then that proprietary software becomes copyleft software because the GPL and related family of licenses requires that the distribution of projects or derivative works using GPL code becomes GPL, or one of the GPL family license. Permissive license into proprietary, again, you can use that if you're adding it with, that was my example of putting a permissively licensed rich text editor in your, I don't know, learning management, or your Nook tool for your chat tool. And it can be proprietary or custom locally developed.